Start when ready.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll kick things off and just want to thank Tim for joining us. With us is Tim Hope, COO of DigiKerma, and wanted to have him give a little presentation about an option or potential solution for financing CCS in the future, and just another possible lever that we can pull to try and advance the commercialization of CCUS. So, with that, Tim, let you take it away.
All right. Thank you, Brian, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm Tim Hope, the COO and head of carbon markets at DigiKerma. We are a startup platform specializing in the carbon market side, specifically focused on CCUS and the entire CCS umbrella. So theoretically, anything that is CO2 flowing through a pipeline destined for geologic storage falls under our remit. But we are focused specifically on the CCUS side, less on things like DAC and that nature, although we do have space on the platform for them. So that's a little background on us. I don't want this to be focused on DigiKerma. I want this to be focused, hopefully, on an educational piece for you guys to understand how the carbon markets are evolving and how they can hopefully help finance CCUS projects here in the US and globally. Can anyone see my screen okay before I start?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay.
It's all good.
Great. So why does CCUS need financing? The climate math is pretty clear. There is no net zero without carbon capture and storage. If you look at all the reputable net zero pathways, they all have a heavy reliance on CCUS, and that reliance on CCUS is actually growing over time. So right now in the IEA Sustainable Development Scenario, which is basically net zero by 2070, CCUS is shown to basically capture 15% of the emissions reductions required between now and then. And by 2070, that ends up being about 7 gigatons a year. And to sort of put that in perspective, that is roughly the same emissions reduction as the IEA is projecting for both solar and wind combined across that same time period. So everyone thinks about renewables, solar and wind, and that's the pathway to net zero. But these modelers are looking at CCUS as being just as important. So that's sort of where we stand right now. And we know that the CCUS project pipeline is growing very quickly. My slide here says it's more than 500 projects in development. I think it's actually now in the 700 plus project range. The issue is that most of these projects are in very early stages of development and have yet to hit their FID targets due to revenue uncertainty. At least here in the US, 45Q is the primary revenue source we all know about. $85 a ton from the US government, and there are similar programs in other countries around the world, similar-ish, I should say. But they're all publicly financed. And that's a great way to kick off the industry and to de-risk it enough where we can transition it over to the private markets. But we need to make that jump to the private markets. 45Q is not going to last forever. We are not going to decarbonize on the backs of public taxpayers indefinitely. And as it sits right now, 45Q has a 12-year cliff. And that's creating a lot of uncertainty in the market with project developers. Either I can do 45Q to get my project financed now, but what happens after year 12? Or my cost of carbon is $150 a ton. How do I make up that additional $65 a ton revenue gap? And so that leads us into the carbon markets and carbon credits. So for those of you who don't know, I'll start at the very bottom. What is a carbon credit? At its core, a carbon credit represents 1 ton of emissions that have either been reduced or removed and verified. Credits are packaged into essentially securities, kind of like stocks and bonds, and are then sold to corporations who are looking to offset their emissions. So if Coca-Cola has 1 million tons of emissions producing their products, they could buy 1 million credits and essentially become net zero. And those credits represent 1 million tons of CO2 reduced or removed from another project. So at its bottom, it's a mechanism to transfer the environmental benefit from one project to a buyer. And that's really how the carbon markets were set up. So before I go into this overview of the carbon markets, I'll just give a little history on them. The first carbon credit was enacted in 1989. There was a coal power plant, I believe it was in Connecticut, and the owner wanted to do something good for the environment and came up with this idea that if they planted millions of trees down in Guatemala, they would capture excess carbon over the prevailing baseline, and they could use the environmental attributes of that captured carbon to offset the emissions from the coal plant. And so they worked with World Resources International, WRI, and they came up with this concept, and they did the very first carbon credit. Over time, the carbon markets have evolved. They've grown. Right now, the voluntary carbon market, which is what we're talking about, is a bit over $1 billion in annual volume. And I'll split these two markets here into compliance and voluntary. You may have heard about these two different markets. The compliance markets are legally mandated. So these are your typical cap and trade type markets, either in California or in Europe, where there's a set amount of emissions for a given industry, and they're required to basically buy permits if they exceed those limits. And there's a set amount of permits given, and they trade back and forth, and that creates a market for these. The big difference there is that the companies under these compliance regimes are legally compelled to trade in these markets and make sure they stay under the regulatory caps. Right now, CCUS doesn't really have a direct role in the compliance markets. It's more focused right now on the voluntary markets. And the voluntary markets are a lot smaller. Compliance markets are around $100 billion market. Voluntary markets are about $1 billion, but they're growing. And the voluntary markets are basically comprised of corporate buyers looking to offset their emissions. They're under no obligation to do so outside of basically public pressure to be good environmental stewards. So that's who the buyers are and the distinction between compliance and voluntary markets. And there's two primary credit types that you might hear about in the carbon markets, nature-based and engineered. Nature-based credits derive typically from forestry type projects. So either planting new trees, like that example from Guatemala, or preventing deforestation, where they're protecting forests that may be cut down for wood, etc. These make up the vast majority of the carbon markets to date. They are substantially cheaper than the other side of the market, which is engineered solutions, and they've been around a lot longer. The flip side of that are the engineered solutions, and as you might guess, that is where CCUS falls under, along with BECCS and direct air capture, biochar, things of that nature. And these are obviously engineered solutions. So man-made, physical, engineered plants that are capturing carbon in some form or another. The upside of an engineered solution is it produces a very high quality credit. The CO2 typically flows through a pipeline where it can be metered very precisely, so we know exactly how much CO2 is being removed, and it can be constantly monitored. And then typically it's destined for some type of very long format storage. So it could be geologic storage in a class 6 well, or in the case of biochar, essentially turned into charcoal bricks and then could be buried in the ground, things like that. So nature-based solutions, if you think about carbon being absorbed into a tree, it's very hard to really determine exactly how much carbon a tree is absorbing, especially when you think about a forest that may have hundreds, if not thousands, of different plant types and tree types, and then different parts of the forest get different rainfall and different sunshine. So you really have to estimate on the whole what's sort of going on in that forest writ large in terms of the amount of carbon it's capturing. Second issue with nature-based solutions is that the storage mechanism is more prone to carbon release. We oftentimes hear people say that a tree only holds carbon for a short amount of time, but a forest is resilient. So forests, as long as they are kept whole, can store carbon for indefinite periods. The problem is they can be cut down. They are prone from forest fires, especially in a warming climate, and also from disease and bugs, also, which is increasing in a warming climate. So these nature-based solutions have a lot more questionable permanence in their storage time frame, whereas again, engineered solutions are engineered to be highly permanent solution on the order of thousands of years. So VCM buyers are typically corporates. So you probably heard about Amazon, Microsoft, and Stripe. They're sort of the corporate leaders. But there's thousands of corporates out there who are buying carbon credits to help offset their emissions, from very small companies to other major companies. And demand is growing, especially for engineered solutions, because they're perceived as very high quality. Again, the exact amount of carbon is known, and the time frame for storage is extremely high. So that's a brief overview of the carbon markets there. I kind of touched on a couple of things in that previous slide about what makes a high quality carbon credit, but I thought I would emphasize them here. There's really three checklist items you want to hit. And the first is called additionality, which is kind of a nebulous term. But what it means is that the carbon credit is only considered a valid and quality carbon credit if the revenue from selling that carbon credit was required to make the carbon project viable. So in the case of CCUS, if you have a CCUS project that can be fully funded and profitable and hit FID with 45Q alone at $85 a ton, you are not really allowed to sell. I shouldn't say not really. You're not supposed to sell, not allowed to sell carbon credits on top of that, because at that point, they're not financially necessary to make the project go through. But if you have a big financing gap, if your cost of capture is 150 a ton and 45Q is 85 a ton, then you can absolutely sell a carbon credit to fill that gap to hit your FID target and make the project viable. So that's additionality. Permanence is just how long the carbon stays out of the atmosphere. With geologic storage, it's on the order of thousands of years. And then once the carbon actually turns into, is absorbed and turns into rock, essentially, it becomes millions of years or permanent. Whereas conversely, nature-based projects are typically assumed to have a lifetime of 30 to 100 years for the issues I just mentioned on the previous slide. So that's permanence. And then the third metric you want to measure for a high quality carbon credit is the ability to accurately measure how much carbon you are capturing. So again, CCUS, you have gaseous CO2 flowing through a pipeline, through a meter, and then into geologic storage. You can measure that extremely accurately. Whereas nature-based systems, you have very complex mathematical formulas to assume across a multi-thousand acre forest how much CO2 is being absorbed on an annual basis. But if you just think about the complexity of living systems and how they might be different from one area to another area, even within the same forest, there's a lot of variability around that measurability. So it's a lot less accurate. So for these reasons, CCUS and engineered credits in general are considered much higher quality than nature-based credits. The flip side of that equation is, of course, that engineered credits cost a lot more. A lot more engineering and work has to go into setting these systems up, whereas you can set up a forestry system, you can plant trees with local people quite cheaply. It's a very low-tech process. So the carbon credits are a lot cheaper. So there's a spectrum, and that spectrum of price to quality is kind of a straight line going left to right, down to up, like a typical graph.
Tim, real quick. So you're talking about when you talk about the the cost. That's the I would say the sale price, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a very good point. I'm sorry, I should have made that distinction. Yeah, so a typical nature-based forestry credit might cost $20 per ton for a decent quality, well-designed program. And we know that DAC, direct air capture costs, are $600 to $1,000 a ton. That's coming down, but still in the multi-hundreds. BEX projects are also probably between 300 and 600. Biochars in the 200-300 maybe. And then CCUS is generally the cheapest of the engineered solutions, which is why we focus on it. And we think the pricing for CCUS is closer to $100 a ton. And obviously it varies across project types. But that provides a relative value spectrum, and I'll touch on that in a minute. The other thing that you want to make sure when you're issuing carbon credits is that you're not double counting or over crediting. And so double counting simply means you can't sell 2 carbon credits for the same ton of carbon that's been removed. And over crediting is a very similar concept. If you've saved 100 tons of carbon, you can't issue 120 credits over that. You have to make sure that your methodologies are rigorous and typically have some sort of reserve bucket, so you're actually under crediting, if anything. So before I go to that, I didn't have a direct slide on this, but I will just briefly talk about where CCUS fits as we see it in the spectrum of engineered solutions and why we think it actually makes the most sense for carbon credits. So going back to that, the pricing I just talked about, we know that DAC is very expensive, up to $1,000 a ton. BEX, Bikers, Biochar are kind of in the middle, and we feel that CCUS projects can be anywhere from $150 to maybe $200 a ton, depending on the project and the specifics of each project. But because engineered credits are engineered, the quality of them is almost identical from type to type. So whether you have a DAC project that is removing CO2 from the atmosphere, or you have a CCUS project that is preventing the release of CO2 into the atmosphere, the end result at a global carbon accounting level is there is 1 less ton of CO2 in the air. Now, because the amount of CO2 actually in the atmosphere is so low, thermodynamically speaking, DAC will always be the hardest way to capture CO2. Right? It's 0.04% CO2 by volume. And so, DAC will always be expensive relative to pretty much every other type. And that's a physics issue. So I don't think we'll really be able to get around that. We'll bring the price of DAC down, but we should also be bringing the price of BEX and CCUS down as well as those prices come down. So given that we feel that the credit quality is the same, it's highly measurable, and it's pretty much all going for geologic permanent storage, you might as well buy the cheapest credit. You'll get the most bang for your buck, or for a given dollar spend, you can buy more tonnage. So if you can get CCUS credits at 100 or DAC credits at 1,000, you could buy 10 CCUS credits for every DAC credit. So when you think about just among the engineered credit space, CCUS really makes the best sense on a value basis. And that's why we think it has a really bright future. And if you look again within the various net zero scenarios, you don't really see DAC and things like that in there nearly as much as you see CCUS. DAC's a very small strip in the IEA scenarios relative to CCUS. So that's where our focus should be. That's where our dollars are going to go the longest way. So this brings us to how CCUS and the carbon markets can come together, and how can we monetize carbon projects. So the first issue I'd like to clear up, and this comes up a lot, is can you sell carbon credits while you're also getting 45Q revenue? And the answer to that is absolutely. The reason for that is 45Q is purely a funding mechanism from the government. The government is not buying the environmental attributes from the project. They are simply funding the project to kick off this industry. The project developer still retains the environmental attribute of all the CO2 stored from their projects. And that allows them to then go to the voluntary carbon markets and sell it for additional revenue. So stacking carbon credit revenues on top of 45Q is absolutely doable. And that's really the best path forward. It's the most straightforward. You can get $85 a ton from the government. If your cost of capture is 150, then if you can sell credits at 65, you're going to make up that entire gap. And now your project is in the black and fundable. So that's where carbon credits come in. And that's basically the pricing mechanism. You can think of it as the marginal amount of financing needed to get your project viable. And the selling price would then be roughly equal to that difference. So that's broadly speaking how you stack credits on top of 45Q. And that would apply outside the US because most governments are not taking the environmental attributes for funding. They're simply providing the funding to kick off these markets as well. But we'll stay focused on the US market for right now. Another issue that comes up, and this is something that we're working on at DigiKerma, is forward offtake agreements. And you may have heard of these. Right now, they're typically bespoke agreements between a buyer and a project developer. Basically, the corporate buyer will agree to buy X amount of tons of carbon credits at some point in the future, maybe 5 years into the future. And they will either pay now, they'll pay a deposit now, or they'll just agree to pay those in the future from the project developer. And what that allows the project developer to do is then show that they have future customers for their carbon. They can go to their banker or their funder, show these forward sale agreements, and that can allow them to complete their financing to get the project off the ground. And the reason this is a problem, obviously, is a CCUS project might take 3 to 5 years to actually come to fruition from the initial planning stages to when everything's done and CO2 is being captured and stored underground. But if you can't sell carbon credits for 5 years, how do you make up that time gap? And so that's where the forward offtake agreement comes into play. So as I mentioned, right now, these are really being done on a bespoke basis. So Microsoft has bought a couple forward contracts with a couple BECCS projects in Europe, and Airbus has done some with DAC. And we're trying to bring that model and put it on our platform in a more standardized approach. It's a work in progress because forward contracts by their nature are quite individualized. But that is, if we can make this feature work, we think that's going to unlock a lot of financing for companies and really bridge that time gap. That's a big project issue.
Hey, Tim, Brian again. Along the same lines, do you also look at and have the ability to do like long-term contracts? So not necessarily forward, the project's up and operating today, but somebody comes in and wants to buy credits for the next 10 years. Do you have the ability to do that, which also provides a lot of certainty for project economics?
Yeah, we can certainly carve out an allotment, and say, okay, you want to buy 50,000 tons a year for the next 10 years, strike an agreement and put that on the platform. Right now, that's not just a click and choose functionality, but we definitely have the technical ability to do it. And we're moving at the speed of the market. So as market demand for new features, new agreement, new financing techniques come along, we're very flexible in how we can enable our system to manage the market demand. So we're not trying to tell the market how it should operate. We're trying to be flexible and responsive to the market needs and project developer needs.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. If the market's not asking for it, there's no need in chasing it down. But the flexibility that your platform has allows you to do a lot of different things for long-term contracting.
Yeah, and that's the nice thing about having a platform that is sort of designed from the ground up for these contracts. It's all it's manageable. It's modular in that we can stack different components on to make the entire tech system work the way that our customers want them to.
Okay.
And so the last bit I'll talk about is what we call these hybrid credits. And this is something that's really theoretical at this point, but we think it works well with the way that we've set up our system. And so take, for example, a BEX project, right? And they're taking forestry residues and they're incinerating them and they're creating power. And the power plant has a CCS project on it. So you're clearly capturing the carbon. So you can sell carbon credits, but you're also clearing out the forest. And there could be a potential benefit to that in terms of reducing the likelihood of forest fires. And so there is the at least theoretical potential to create call it a forest fire prevention credit and sell those. And it doesn't really matter what the value of them is specifically, it's another stackable credit because now you're not so much talking about the carbon issue, you're talking about just a prevention either of the fire damage themselves to communities, the air quality, however you want to value the prevention of forest fires like Canada had 2 years ago. If a BEX project that's clearing forestry residues can be shown with the methodology to actually help prevent that, you could monetize that benefit, right? That's a benefit to society. It has some sort of value. And so long as you can properly model that, you can capture it, put it in a credit, and sell it. And that can further help monetize these projects. So now you start to stack different layers of revenue streams, and then that's how you hopefully get to FID on a lot of these projects over time.
So that's really, that's more beneficial on, kind of the nature based, if you will, kind of fire prevention actually would bolster the value of a nature based project.
It certainly could. Most nature-based projects are either preventing deforestation, but they could also be preventing forest fire. That would absolutely fall into that category. But if you could also link it directly to, an engineered project like a BEX project where there's a forestry component of it, but it's actually going into, an engineered solution, CCS project that's sitting on top of a bioenergy plant. So there's a lot of different ways to skin that cat. And no one's doing this right now. But hypothetically, we like to think about it as ways to innovate and get more revenue sources for the market. Risks and considerations. The big risk here, verification and MRV, they have to be really good. That is a big issue with nature-based projects, again, is they're hard to verify and they're hard to monitor, at least with a lot of accuracy. That is getting better now. Now we have, a lot more satellite information and we've got LiDAR scanning and all these different things. So the people working in that space realize that's an area that needs improvement, and then bringing a lot of tech firepower to that side of the market. So those projects are getting better as well. The nice thing about engineered projects is almost by their very nature, because they're engineered, the measurement and verification is basically embedded in the design of the system itself, right? We have CO2 flowing through gas meters, so we know exactly how much it is. We have it going, underground into a well. We know it's down there. We know, we have tight tolerances for design, prevention of leakage. EPA rules to qualify for 45Q are extremely complex and onerous. So we feel that if you're meeting the 45Q requirements to be eligible for funding, that's really the gold standard in making sure that your MRV process is as high as it can get. So for engineered solutions, those two things basically go hand in hand, which really lowers the risk from market participants considering MRV issues. Market and pricing, we kind of talked about this. Huge range right now in prices. Nature-based credits, bad nature-based credits trade for several pennies, 5-10 cents a ton. But it's questionable if you're really getting any benefit at those prices. Good nature-based projects are probably trading from $10 to 50, 50 for some of the more complex projects like mangroves and things like that. And then the engineered solutions, typically start in the high double digits, 80 to 100, and go all the way up to 1,000 for DAC, depending on the technology. So a very wide range of pricing, which causes a lot of confusion on the buyer's side too. Why would I pay 1,000 when I can get one for 10? But what does that tell me about the $10 credit? And how do I, how can they both be the same thing when one is priced at 100 times the other? So it's good to understand sort of the different structure and complexities and risks and quality issues within all these types of credits. Last point I'll touch on here is this convergence between the voluntary carbon market and the compliance markets. And we've seen over the last several years, this push towards bringing these two together. It doesn't make a lot of sense to have a voluntary and a compliance market. As more and more companies start to participate in the voluntary carbon market, a lot of them view it as almost compliance themselves, at least in the public eye. But eventually, we want all of these companies to have to be responsible for their emissions. And we know that companies cannot completely avoid emissions in their everyday processes. So that's why they need a market to go into to be able to offset their emissions and still operate. So this is going to be a long, slow process, and it's very complex. And there's a lot of different parties, and they have a lot of different interests, and it's a lot of push and pull. But we do see over the coming, who knows, 5, 10, 20 years, this convergence between the voluntary carbon markets and the compliance markets. And what that means for CCUS type projects is that's a good thing, because the more that the carbon markets become a compliance tool rather than a voluntary optional tool, it just means more stable funding for projects. It'd be a shame if I didn't plug my own company here, so I'm just going to go ahead and let you guys know what we do. DigiKerma is a marketplace built specifically for CCUS credits. It is built on the blockchain. The reason that we built it on the blockchain is because we feel that ensures full visibility, full tracking, and full auditability of CCUS credits. So every credit on the blockchain, you can see where it was issued, where it's traded, where it is now, when it is eventually retired. It can't be unretired. We've developed a unique carbon tag, which is basically metadata about each carbon credit that travels along with each carbon credit throughout its life. So it could show where the carbon project was, when that actual tonnage was captured by the system, where it was stored geologically, when it was deposited, etc. And also, if there were ever to be a leakage issue, if a Class 6 well did leak, you can then go back and you can note within the carbon tag issues like that. So these systems just carry a lot more information and make tracking and auditability really less of an issue, which has also been an issue on the carbon markets historically, because they've kind of just traded on really rudimentary markets that were designed by some of the registries like Vera and Gold Standard, but there was not a lot of visibility into those. So we're trying to make everything transparent and standardized and built for scale. That's all I'm going to say about DigiKerma. So closing thoughts. I think we all know that CCUS is technically ready and it's needed. Now we just need to find the way to finance it to make sure we can bring it to fruition. We feel carbon markets are the best way to fill that gap. 45Q and other government funding is not going to last forever. 45Q currently has a 12-year gap, 12-year cliff when it runs out. And so that's basically our timeline to get the carbon markets really up and running so that these projects can be financed continuously into the future. So let's finance some projects and store some carbon. So thank you very much.
Hey, Tim, thank you so much. I just saw there was a chat, but I think everybody can ask questions if they want. And so, I mean, in the chat, there was a request for elaborating more on the
Yep.
concept of the eventual retirement of the credit.
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. I shouldn't have brushed over that. So when a project issues a carbon credit, that's basically when the carbon credit is born, right? The CO2 is physically deposited in a Class 6 well or wherever it's eventually going to be stored, and the company issues a carbon credit, and they sell it to Microsoft. Now, Microsoft then owns that credit, but to actually use it to offset their emissions, it's what they call retirement. So from an accounting standpoint, you retire the credit, which basically means you say, I've used this credit. I have offset an emission. So I have marked my corporate emissions balance sheet down one, and I have to make a likewise entry in my logbook that I have now retired this carbon credit. It can never be sold again. It now has zero value. It's retired and dead because you've offset that emission. And that was a big issue a lot of times because credits were being used multiple times. There was no secure way to track the retirement, and there was just a fuzzy gray space between them. But when you do it on a regulated system, be it blockchain or anything else, you just need to make sure that when the credit is retired, it's permanently retired, and that's the end of the lifespan of that carbon credit.
Ramon, did that get? Yep. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Tim. Great presentation. Very informative. I would like to ask you. So yeah. One thing that wasn't in my mind was that temporary value of that credit that you already explained, right? But how do you how can we explain or connect that credit in time? I mean, so this is a year-based credit or what? Do you understand what I'm
Are you
trying to
talking about
figure
the
out?
forward contract concept?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So with a forward contract, traditionally, I'll start there. When you have a carbon credit, you wouldn't issue a carbon credit until the CO2 that you've captured has been captured and stored. That is traditionally the way a carbon credit was issued. The project would do whatever it's going to do. It would verify CO2 has been removed, stored, and then they would issue a credit afterwards. Now, that works well with nature-based projects because they're relatively cheap to set up and they can start capturing carbon relatively quickly. Engineered solutions are very expensive, right? It might cost $1 billion to fund a CCUS project, and it might take 5 years. So if you need carbon credits to fund that project, but you can't get carbon credits for 5 years because you can't actually store carbon until the project is done, how do you bridge that gap? And so all a forward contract is an agreement between the project developer, A, and a buyer, B, say Microsoft. And Microsoft will just enter into a binding agreement saying, I will agree today to buy 1 ton of carbon from you, 1 carbon credit from you, based on your project, your CCS project, whatever it is, in 2030 when the project is done. And I'll pay $150 a ton for it. So the carbon credit doesn't go by year. It's a unit of CO2 prevented from going into the atmosphere or removed from the atmosphere. The temporal difference is just you're doing it before the actual carbon capture event has occurred. And you're just making a forward agreement with the counterparty, just a handshake, written agreement. I will pay you $150 for that credit in 5 years if your project succeeds and actually starts storing carbon. And then the project developer can take all of these forward agreements and go to their banker and say, look, lend me the money to do this project now because I have revenue customers waiting. I just need to get the project off the ground, and then I have all these customers who are going to pay 150 a ton as soon as I start storing carbon. And so that de-risks the bank's money. They're lending. They're more likely to lend you because now they can see, yes, there is demand for your product, so we'll get repaid. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great.
Any other questions? Oh, there we go.
Nicholas? Thanks, Brian. I apologize if I missed this, but before we actually sell the carbon credit, would we still need to go through an organization like Gold Standard or Verra to quantify that and ensure the monitoring plan is appropriate?
Yeah, so there's no hard and fast rules about that. The legacy registries, so the Gold Standards and the Verras, were really set up initially for the nature-based credits, right? Because it was very unclear how much carbon was being stored, what the assumptions were. If you think about, if you're preventing deforestation, you're preventing something that hasn't occurred, right? You can't really ever prove that you prevented deforestation because it might not have ever have happened. So the registries came up with these relatively complex methodologies to try and get around these conceptual constraints. But when you get to the engineered side, everything is a lot more straightforward, right? You don't need a Verra to come in and tell you how much CO2 you've stored with a complex mathematical model when you have a meter on your pipeline measuring exactly how much CO2 is flowing through it. Nor do you need to estimate how long you're going to store it when it's going into a class 6 well, and we know that class 6 wells have stored gas and oil for millions of years naturally. So there's a lot less need for a third-party verifier. Now, the market is sort of slow to move on this. They're very conservative. Initially, the market wanted a Verra or Gold Standard to come in and offer third-party verification for these projects. But you don't really get a lot of value from that. And the market is slowly coming to realize that for engineered projects, you don't really need a third-party verifier. It's still being done right now, but we don't think that that's the model that's going to be going long-term forward on the engineered side, because the quality and the measurability and the permanence are embedded by design in these engineered systems. So that might be a bit of a gray area answer. And right now the market is in a transition period between deciding where they are in this issue, but they are definitely trending away from requiring third-party verification for these types of solutions, so long as everything else is up to spec. And again, if you're meeting the EPA requirements, if you ever look at the EPA requirements to get 45Q funding, they're incredibly onerous and rigorous and complex, much more so than any of the registry methodologies for these types of projects.
So then would it be, I guess, on a burden for the purchaser of those credits to be tracking the emitter and the storage site operator to ensure that what they're paying for is actually what's going in the ground?
Well, again, to get 45Q, you're not just the project capture is not just emailing the EPA on a monthly basis. We store this much carbon, send us this much money, right? It's extremely highly regulated and monitored as part of the funding process. So all of that, if you're getting 45Q, all of that rigor is already being embedded in the system itself as part of that 45Q funding process. Same thing with well monitoring. Like class 6 well permitting is extremely hard and long because there's a lot of regulatory oversight on it. No one's just willy-nilly drilling holes in the ground and storing carbon. So again, we think that those parts of the process that really make up the MRV are already being captured by the regulatory requirements. Now, if you're not getting 45Q, that's a different story. But I don't think there's really many projects going forward that are trying to rely on the carbon credit markets, but not 45Q, at least in the US, right? That's going to be your first go-to is going to be 45Q because it's government insured money. But stepping back 30,000 feet, this is a very nascent market. We're at the very beginning of how this market is going to shape up over the next decade. So we don't have 100% clarity and view on how it's really going to shape. So everything I'm saying is partly my view on how the market is going to evolve and where it is right now.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Sure.
Tim, another question. This is Ramon again.
Yeah.
I'm an energy economist, so that's why a lot of things are going around my head. So,
Sure.
what are the life cycle analysis considerations in order to validate a credit? Meaning that, well, you can say, or even storage any amount of CO2 that you want, but is that amount really a negative, a net negative emission? I mean, you're storing more than what you're emitting in the whole process, in the whole value chain process. What I'm trying to say is that one thing is the absolute emission reduction, but the other part is the net emission reduction, because all the process that we are going through are going to emit through the whole value chain of that process. So what are your considerations around this issue?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So, we think that, again, so netting is important, right? Because you don't want to have a process that just stores less carbon than it actually costs in terms of emissions to capture it, which I think is where your question comes from. Again, with engineered systems, though, you can track the cost of your capture very very easily, right? You know how much electricity is being used for your compressors, and you know how much gas is being used for your boilers. And each CCUS project can be designed quite differently, and so there's a lot of different moving parts across the entire chain, from capture to compression to storage to transport. And so there does have to be a lot of thought into how you do that, but the components are all there in hard number, right? You don't have to, there's very little assumption to be done. So all the companies that we talk to that want to capture carbon and store it themselves, or capture carbon and store it and sell credits, have very complex, well thought out, detailed analyses on how they net out their embedded emissions cost to get to a net tonnage. And I like that approach more. It maybe involves a bit of trust, but that trust, it's also verifiable, because if you compare that to a nature-based credit, if you ever wanted to just melt your mind, look at like a Vera, legacy Vera registry document on methodology on how to track the carbon in a forest. And it's all just calculus and equations and all sorts of things. There's no way to ever make sense of it unless you're a PhD in like forestry modeling. So those are actually a lot more complex and opaque than engineered solutions. Second, I will admit I'm biased against the registries. For a long time, they were really aligned with the project developers, and they were not doing a good job at all. The red market blew up 2 or 3 years ago because almost all the projects were over-crediting, very poorly designed, and the companies involved, the registries, especially Vera, in particular, which was the big 800-pound gorilla in the registry space, just had poorly designed methodologies, and they were getting paid by the project developers to essentially allow the project developers to do whatever they wanted. And that really gave the market a black eye, which wasn't good for the carbon markets. Things are improving, right? You learn lessons. So the new era of methodologies from these companies are better, and they're using more technology, and it's more verifiable. But when we talk to project developers and they talk about how they're going to track all their carbon and everything, they have they know their project inside and out better than any third party. And they know that in order to get these things funded, they have to have a good MRV plan. They're not talking about investing $2-3 million in a project. They're talking about investing $2-3 billion, in a project. So it's crucial for them to get it right. And they know that. So I think we need to have a bit of trust in the market, but with the engineered approaches, it's a lot easier to really ascertain the inputs, the energy inputs, whether it's gas, whether it's electricity, across all those processes, because they're engineered, right? They're blueprinted, they're documented, and you can just look at your electricity and gas bill basically as a company and see exactly how much, and you have energy coefficients for each process, and you can figure out what your net emissions were, and you subtract that out of your gross emissions.
Thank you.
Sorry for the long-winded answer there. I hope that helped.
So I know with nature-based credits, there at least used to be some premium associated with certain types, like a blue ocean credit.
Yep.
Are you seeing any premiums associated with in the CCS field, maybe the storage location, offshore versus certain regions of the country?
We're so early on in the actual voluntary carbon market for these projects that there's very little credits actually being issued. We're trying to build this market. I could say that I think that you'll find, and a lot of the pricing difference is down to the technology type, right? Like a DAC project is always going to be more than a CCUS project, but that's not a quality, a premium. It's just a function of the cost of, the thermodynamic energy required to get DAC to work. I think you will see, differences if the market expands enough to where there's choice within the market across multiple different project types, that there will be a preference among buyers for some projects based on whatever criteria, right? Maybe they really do like a BEX project with, that's cleaning up forestry residue because they feel there's a additional value in that forestry cleanup. And so they might like that over, just taking wood pellets and throwing them into a biomass plant. But it's really a bit early to tell. There's just not enough projects out there to really split hairs like that at this point.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, well, we are rounding up on the hour here. Tim, I really appreciate your time. I think everyone learned a lot today. Thank you again. And if anyone has any questions, we can direct you to Tim and help connect you if you've got additional questions after this. As we wrap up, one quick reminder, our next session, and I'm not exactly sure if it's going to be in the commercialization or it may be a larger session, but the next thing that we kind of have on the calendar is going to be a presentation by Sally Greenberg on the current status of the ADM project up in Illinois. So, Tim, to one of your points, a little bit of a question on the storage side, but again, that's a very unique situation up at ADM, and I think to your point earlier, the Class 6 regulations and whatnot provide for a very secure geologic storage.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Brian, thank you for taking the time to have me, and everyone, thank you. I hope you guys enjoyed and maybe learned something.
Great. Thank you so much, all. Have a great day.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks, Shaw. Very good job.
Thank you.